This lecture is going to be about adolescent brain development. And the theme of the lecture is that the teenage brain is under construction. So what we've got going on is first the limbic system. So the limbic system really becomes fully mature during puberty. So when all of those hormonal changes start happening, the brain is really going through a big shift where the limbic system starts to take over because it's becoming fully online. So the limbic system is in charge of emotions. This is where we see the reward-seeking behaviors, risk-taking, adrenaline, and all of those really emotional kinds of responses. So we find that the adolescent brain is more vulnerable to things like substance abuse and mental health problems because this limbic system is really becoming fully mature during puberty. So we have emotions ruling the adolescent brain. Then the other part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the prefrontal cortex. Now this part of the brain becomes fully developed and mature in the mid-20s. So if we've got the limbic system fully developed during puberty, which is happening earlier and earlier, so we could have, even ages 10 to 12 having a pretty developed limbic system, and then the prefrontal cortex does not develop until the mid-20s. So we've got the limbic system really ruling the adolescent brain for about a decade. So the prefrontal cortex is in charge of planning and decision making, things like weighing consequences, problem solving, and impulse control, which is probably one of the more important functions. This is sometimes called the brakes of the brain. So this would be when you're thinking about doing something, and an adolescent who is lacking in impulse control is just going to go ahead and jump into that without really thinking about it, whereas an adult brain would think, wait a second, this might not be the best idea, let me stop and think about this before I just jump into a decision. So this prefrontal cortex is kind of the CEO of the brain, kind of regulates all of these decision-making behaviors, but isn't developed until the mid-20s. So we see adolescents kind of with this imbalance, the limbic system being in charge and the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet. So as a result of this imbalance, there's a few things that happen during adolescence, these three different kind of fables that happen. So first is the invincibility fable, this it won't happen to me type of thinking. So adolescents can definitely logically understand that there are consequences. It's not that they don't realize the consequences are there. They just think they're somehow invincible or somehow immune to the consequences. So when we look at teenage pregnancy, for the most part, they do know how babies are made, but they just don't consider those consequences fully when they're making that decision impulsively. So that impulse control is not there. So they think about something, they just jump into it without really thinking about weighing all the consequences. They think, oh, I'm sure it won't happen to me. They just really downplay the bad things that could happen. Then we've got the imaginary audience. That's when they feel like everyone's watching. The spotlight is on them. So a teenager won't leave the house if their hair is a certain way, or they feel like everyone's staring at them. They're super self-conscious because they feel like it's a very egocentric kind of time of life when they're really focused on themselves. So that's another thing that's happening in their brain development. And then the last one would be the personal fable, which is thinking I'm the exception to the rule. So adolescents tend to have these thoughts of they're the greatest, they're the ones that are going to make it. So maybe an example of, I like to think about like trying out for one of those singing competitions, the TV, like American Idol or The Voice or, something like that. So they think like I could be the one when in reality, when we think about the percentage of people who actually become rich and famous being a singer is a tiny, tiny percentage. But as a teenager, you think like I'm going to be the one to make it. Like I'm that special and there's nobody that's ever been as great as me, So it's a very egocentric kind of way of thinking. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing though. So when we look at these types of imbalances, there are some good things about it. Because when you think about it, the people that usually do win those singing competitions are the teenagers, the younger people, because they don't have all these inhibitions. They don't have all these fears. They think that they can make it and they go and they give it a try. So when we think about like positive risk taking, that's one of these examples. They're willing to put themselves out there and to really go for something big, whereas someone older that has more inhibitions, they have more impulse control, they might be weighing all of these consequences and talking themselves out of really doing something great. So teenagers have all these possibilities that they really could do something amazing because they're not as worried about taking a risk. So that can be a good thing when we look at, I'm going to apply for an Ivy League school. Hey, that's a huge risk. Some people might be worried that they're not going to get in, so then they wouldn't even try. But a lot of teenagers, because they don't have all of those worries, and they just are impulsive, so they think, hey, sure, why not? I'm going to go apply for that Ivy League school. And you know what? They might get in, and then they might do something amazing. With sports, it's the same type of thing. They're going to really, really try their best, and they think, I'm going to go to be in the NFL. Where when we know that statistically the number of people who actually make it into the NFL is very tiny, but that's why they can dream big, and it can be a very good thing. So we don't always want to squash these kinds of things. We really do want to look at adolescence in a positive light, just so we can think about some of the positive aspects of this brain development. It also really helps them establish their independence because they're willing to try new things. And that's a really important part of the teenage years, is becoming their own self, becoming independent from their parents. So this imbalance in their brain actually helps them to be able to do that because they're willing to try new things. They're not as worried about all of the things that could go wrong. And they're also sensitive to social and emotional cues, which is a very good skill to have, to be able to be in tune to your emotions. So there's a lot of good things going on in the adolescent brain. Unfortunately, there are a lot of cons that come with that too. We see a lot of negative risk taking. So, there's a lot of peer pressure, things like that. They don't think about consequences, so then they make bad decisions because they're not thinking about what might happen if they do this. They're more willing to try drugs, alcohol, risky sexual behaviors because they're not thinking about the consequences and they're more impulsive. And then on the flip side of being more sensitive to social and emotional cues, they're also more susceptible to emotional problems during this time. So when we look at adolescents being emotional, that can be a good thing, but it can also lead them to be more susceptible to things like depression, anxiety, substance abuse, things like that. And then they're also egocentric, which kind of sounds like they're selfish. It's not really the same thing, though. Egocentric just means they really focus on their own point of view. So they see things from their own point of view, and it's harder for them to see something from someone else's point of view. And it's really a cognitive thing that they're doing. It's not that they're selfish. It's just they really have a harder time thinking of what someone else might be thinking, someone else's point of view. So they're egocentric in that they think a lot of them about themselves, that they're the center of the universe, and it takes a while for them to mature and kind of grow out of that. So that's some highlights about adolescent brain development.